Today's guest is one of the most fascinating national security minds of the last half century. Dr. Jonathan Lockwood is a retired U.S. Army colonel, a former GS-15 senior intelligence official, and widely regarded as the Godfather of Analytics. He holds a PhD in international affairs, authored the seminal works The Soviet View of U.S. Strategic Doctrine and The Russian View of U.S. Strategy, and created the Lockwood Analytical Method for prediction, known as LAMP, which is still used across the U.S. intelligence community today. Over a 40-plus year career, Dr. Lockwood has taught, analyzed, and wargamed America's most complex strategic challenges, from nuclear deterrence and space warfare to Russia, China, and the future of U.S. power. He has served as a professor at the National Intelligence University, a senior curriculum manager at the Department of Homeland Security, and a strategic planner advising on Russian aggression and great power competition. He has traveled to Moscow, Minsk, Munich, and beyond for intelligence research, helped shape war games like The Army After Next, and remains a frequent commentator on the Russia-China-Ukraine conflict. This is a very rare opportunity to sit down with one of the most sharp minds, most forward-thinking strategic minds alive, someone whose insight can genuinely change how you see the world. I love that last portion of it, too. That's my favorite part.
What is this now? Oh, your favorite part?
The last little bit of the introduction. One of the most sharp minds, and I've certainly come to appreciate that already in our brief conversations, and I am certainly looking forward to diving deeper into the rest of this conversation today.
Well, when I looked at the draft of what were your prepared remarks, and it's like I sent you back my reaction that says, "Wow, after an introduction like that, I can hardly wait to hear what I'm going to say."
I think everyone's on the edge of their seat for sure. We're excited about this episode tonight, to say the least. So I wanted to start off. We're going to cover a number of different topics tonight, and one of the main areas that you seem to be covering, especially as of late, a lot, is the Russia-Ukraine situation.
Yes.
So this has been ongoing for a while now. And for those that are not aware of how far back this goes, right, with Ukraine specifically, would you mind just jumping into a little bit of a background on the Russia-Ukraine scenario and maybe where you see us going in the next 1, 2, 3 years, and if a peace deal is even close to happening?
Yeah. Right now, well, that's a several-part question. First of all, the Russia-Ukraine, as most of our viewers may be aware, the Russia-Ukraine war itself started back in February of 2022. And there were warning signs before this, because back in 2014, Russia had illegally annexed the Crimea, which is an integral part of Ukraine. They annexed it, and when Vladimir Putin didn't see any visible reaction by the West to its annexation of Crimea, well, obviously Putin saw this as a signal and said, well, I can get away with more. So after some political maneuvering and military maneuvers, in February 2022, he thought it was going to be easy. He thought it would be over within a day or so. They launched their invasion. They thought it was going to be just a parade right into Kiev. And what they failed to appreciate was that the Ukrainians had not changed much in the past century. And they loathe the Russians just as much now as they did back then. And so the Kiev, the Western allies and all the military experts in the West were fully anticipating that Ukraine would collapse within a few days. Well, lo and behold, all of a sudden the Ukrainians surprised everyone. They successfully resisted. They began inflicting massive casualties on the Russian army. And before you know it, now over the course of this past 3+ years, the Ukrainians have been successfully resisting the Russian invasion. The Russians have taken over 1 million casualties. It is the largest conflict since World War II. It is the largest conflict easily of the 21st century, but no conflict since World War II even approaches it in scale.
Right.
So now you have a situation where the Russians have been steadily trying to wear down Ukraine in a war of attrition, and it has not been working very well. The Ukrainians have a very strong defensive line in the east, and the Russians have been, they be able to gain a few yards. They claim they've gained a few hundred yards here or a few hundred yards there, and the Ukrainians, just as quickly take it back in a counterattack.
Right.
And what the Ukraine has introduced, and what both sides have introduced, which is the most distinguishing feature of the Russian-Ukrainian war, is the widespread use of drones. Robot drones. Think of the 1984 movie Terminator. If you saw those scenes of future warfare with robots, hunting humans, well, this is the future brought into sharp relief. It is a situation.
The fiber optic drones are unique as well. Right?
Yes, they are.
This is also, and maybe this is incorrect, but this is the first time those kinds of drones have been used in a war-like setting. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay.
Now, the use of drones themselves, as a general concept, they have a much longer history. The history of robots or unmanned types of weapons, they actually, when you look at military history very carefully, they actually go back centuries. Wow, what do I mean by this? Well, the use of drones goes back to mechanical drones or flying drones, goes back to World War II. The Germans had the V1 buzz bomb, a flying unpiloted drone, which they launched thousands of those against England during the latter stages of World War II. They weren't terribly accurate. Basically, all they did was the Germans just point them in the general direction of England and see where it lands.
And then they were called buzz bombs.
The slang term was buzz bomb.
Okay.
And in one Hollywood movie portraying the use of these, the RAF had a very clever tactic for defeating some of these drones. They would send out a plane to fly next to the V1 buzz bomb while it was coming in. It would get underneath the wing because it was pilotless, of course, and they would tip up. They would tip up the drone and cause it to spiral down into the water.
Huh.
Great tactic, but you couldn't stop all of them. And the most frightening thing about the buzz bomb was that you could see it coming. It was flying low and slow. And when it ran out of fuel, that was the most frightening moment because it was about to plunge to Earth with a high explosive charge and blow up.
So I guess they set it up with just enough fuel to get a certain distance, and then ideally it fell within that distance.
Yeah, it would just run out and it would hit some random target. It was a terror. The Germans called it a vengeance weapon. Vengeance Weapon 1. Vengeance Weapon 2, the V2, was the first ballistic missile. You would reach an altitude of about 60 miles. It had a gyroscope guidance system, and it would come down. There was no way to stop it. The British or the Allies didn't have any kind of an anti-ballistic missile system at that time, and so the V2s were essentially unstoppable. And their primary weakness was, the Allies had just had invaded France, and once one of the big priorities for the Allies was to reach those launch sites to shut off the launching of V2s, and that was how those were. If you go back even farther in history, you could even say that drones started back during the age of sailing ships, wooden sailing ships. The British Navy and other navies had something they called fire ships. You would literally set a wooden sailing ship on fire, and you would sail it into the middle of an opposing enemy fleet, hoping that, of course, that fire ship would collide with one of the other ships and set it on fire. Very primitive, but a use of drones. So you can trace that sort of thing back. But now the Ukrainians have taken, and the Russians, but more so the Ukrainians, have taken drone warfare to a whole new level. The Ukrainian army is basically conserving manpower, but essentially by hiding behind a shield of drones.
Right.
They are letting the robots do most of the fighting for them. And the U.S. military has taken due note of this and said, we can learn a lot from the Ukrainians about how best to develop. And don't be surprised if at the end of this war, as well as thereafter, the Ukrainian military ends up teaching the U.S. military how to use drones, how to wage drone warfare. And the U.S. military will be taking due notes and learning some very valuable lessons in the hope for hopefully we won't have to do this, but in case we do, at least we'll have some of the best teachers for how to wage drone warfare.
Unfortunately, but yes,
Yeah.
some of the best teachers because of their experiences. And I've had now a number of probably 3 or 4 podcasts specifically focused on Russia, Ukraine, and I think one of the biggest questions for me has over the years, as this has continued, it's really been: is Russia stronger as a country now or weaker than it was in 2014, 2022? Is Ukraine stronger and or weaker as a country with the death toll on both sides and the devastation on both sides? Where do they actually stand now?
Well, there is a phrase that the Russians like to use during their Soviet period, which they call the correlation of forces. And they always asserted that the correlation of forces is continually moving in favor of socialism, because they ideologically they regarded the victory of socialism, it was, according to them, historically inevitable. Therefore, by definition, the correlation of forces is always moving in favor of socialism. So now, applying this to the current conflict, I would say that the correlation of forces is steadily moving in favor of Ukraine, because the Russian initial military offensives failed, and the Ukrainians have more than held their own. They are currently, according to my fellow podcaster Sasha Starr on our Russia-China-Ukraine show, the current casualty rate is 5-1. The Russians are suffering 5 times greater casualties and killed compared to the Ukrainians, and this is unsustainable for Russia. It is unsustainable for them in terms of population. They have always had severe demographic distortions due to the heavy casualties they took from World War II. Right. But now these additional casualties that they're taking are going to produce even greater demographic distortions in the Russian population once this war ends. They are going to be suffering the consequences of this war for decades. And they have passed what Clausewitz used to call the culminating point. Clausewitz used to assert that at the beginning of every offensive, the attacker progresses to a certain point, and then at some point he reaches the culminating point, the very limits of what he can do with his offensive before he has to stop and regroup, and that's the culminating point. Right. When the defender then has an opportunity to counterattack and drive back the attacker. Russia has long since passed the culminating point. They can no longer maintain any kind of offensive momentum, and their logistics, which have always been terrible, they are now having to use donkeys to bring their supplies forward, and bicycles, motorcycles. They don't have.
I've seen some of the videos, and sometimes nowadays, especially with AI, I just in my head I think, are they actually using donkeys or mules? Are they actually using animals at this point?
Wow. Their logistics system, and logistics is remember for our viewers, logistics is the science of supply. Right. There is no army better in the world at the science of supply than the American army. We have this down. We have this to a level of perfection which is unbelievable. Ever since World War II, and which is when we were absolutely the most powerful war machine ever created. Right. But now you have with logistics, the Russians have been historically terrible at logistics. During World War II, they were primarily using horse-drawn wagons to move their supplies. And the Germans were too, to a certain extent. They had better motorization. They were 10% motorized, the German army was, when they invaded Russia, World War II. But they had that. But the U.S. Army, by the way, by the time they invaded at Normandy, they were 100% motorized. So we were able to go back across France faster in 1944 than the Germans did back in 1940. So logistics is a very powerful strength of the U.S. Army and a very critical weakness of the Russian Army. So, as a matter of fact, the Russians would not have been able to do very well at all in World War II had it not been for the United States supplying Russia with Ford trucks. We supplied them with Ford trucks, and the Russians loved those trucks. They were simple, easy to maintain, made their logistics and their offensives much more feasible. And they hung on to those trucks after World War II, and they used them to death.
I'm sure they did. I'm sure they did.
But now because the Russians aren't getting that kind of logistical support from any foreign power, certainly not the United States, the Russians have been experiencing huge difficulties in supplying and sustaining their offensive operations. And this is not generally recognized very well in the West. But now the results and effects of this are becoming very visible. So now the Ukrainians, for their part, have a very good logistics system. They have the support of their NATO allies. They are making arrangements with various NATO countries to supply and provide them with new weapons. Ukraine has been steadily getting stronger and stronger in both its military equipment. They have not had to resort yet to more extensive mobilization of their population, and that's the use of drones and other force multipliers has enabled them to pull this off. And in recent podcasts on our Ukraine show, we believe that the Ukrainians are saving their strength to launch a decisive counteroffensive. A decisive counteroffensive which would, in my view, be aimed at liberating the Crimea. Get Crimea back. Cut Crimea off from reinforcement and resupply, thus isolating the Russian occupiers. And then the Ukrainians would use whatever strategic reserve they have created to launch their counteroffensive and force the surrender of the Russians in Crimea. At that point, you have a decisive military defeat of the Russian military, which they will not be able to disguise. They will not be able to explain it away or say, oh, we meant to do that. No. It will be a decisive and highly visible defeat, which will lay the groundwork for, at the very least, an armistice. At the maximum result would be the Russians would say, the heck with this, we're going to declare victory and go home. And they will pull out of Ukraine. Now, they could well do that. As a matter of fact, Sasha and I were discussing this on our program today, that the Russians have so devastated the four eastern oblasts that they have occupied, or partially occupied, that they could just say, okay, we'll give it back to you, because it's largely destroyed, unlivable. And the Ukrainians would have a next several years, hopefully with the aid of European allies and hopefully the U.S., being able to restore and repair and rebuild that portion of Ukraine that the Russians had occupied. But right now, it very much looks like a World War I battlefield, devastated, just piles of stones.
Why do you think it took? It seems to have taken. I don't actually know, right? Everything is not always what it seems, but it seems to have taken President Trump a lot longer to recognize his inability to negotiate with Putin than maybe he would have liked to have been.
And I can explain that one pretty easily.
I'd appreciate that.
You have to appreciate this, that President Trump brought into the presidency his own unique mindset for how to conduct international affairs. Now, he's from New York. He's a businessman. He believes that, like a lot of New Yorkers, everyone's willing to make a deal. He can't imagine someone who would be unwilling to make a deal, especially if you set up the terms right. But President Trump, for the first time in his life, encountered a leader who is not interested in making a deal. Vladimir Putin is a dictator. He can have whatever economic resources he wants. You can't bribe him with anything. His currency is power. He wants control. He wants to restore the Russian Empire. That is not subject to deal making. You can't make a deal with someone like that.
I guess a part of me wanted to think that after one term in office, he would have already realized that.
Well, one term in office, remember, Russia had not invaded.
Correct.
Russia was deterred, effectively discouraged from Russia from invading. President Trump was correct in saying that, if I had been president, reelected back then, Russia would never have invaded. Probably because they realized their assessment of him was, You don't want to mess with this guy. If you hit him, he'll hit you back harder.
Right.
So they were to skirt. But when President Biden took office, their assessment of him was, here's someone we can bully and get away with aggression. So unfortunately, the election of President Biden, in one sense, made the invasion of Ukraine inevitable. Because remember, when Russia illegally annexed Crimea, Biden was Obama's vice president.
Right.
And so they assessed those two. Oh, if we invade, they won't do anything. They won't do anything. So, but now with President Trump in office, and now with President Trump's eyes have been opened over the past year. Now, there is precedent for this in American history, because President Jimmy Carter, when he was elected back in 1976, he was lecturing us that we shouldn't have this inordinate fear of communism. And he was very pacifistic, very, very, shall we say, soft on the Soviet Union.
Right.
But then came the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979, December, on Christmas Day of all things. And President Carter, a devout Christian, God bless his soul, he was deeply offended. For the first time, he recognized the true evil nature of the Soviet Union, and he reacted in a fit of righteous anger. He boycotted the Moscow Olympics, he imposed a grain embargo on the Soviet Union, and most crucially of all, he initiated a major defense buildup. All Ronald Reagan had to do when he got elected president was just step on the accelerator. He didn't have to initiate the buildup. Carter had done that for him. And he could just step on it and accelerate the buildup, and there you went from there. So right now, in the same way, in a parallel way, President Trump had his eyes opened by the brutality and unwillingness of Vladimir Putin to make a deal. President Trump had thought that he could make a deal. He was wrong. He realized that he's wrong. And now he's saying, okay, time to start taking the gloves off.
Yep. If you were to advise President Zelensky currently, and also, and I guess I'll also ask this about Vladimir Putin as well. If you were to advise both of them today on the best next steps for their country, what would you suggest? And well, I guess we'll start with Zelensky first. What do you think the best route for him would be in order to end this war and continue on?
If I was talking to him separately, I would say if you've got a counteroffensive prepared, if you're prepared to isolate the Crimea and launch and throw the equivalent of a knockdown punch against the Russians, you better do it quick, because your position is steadily improving, but you do not want, for the sake of your own country and its economic recovery and its ability to become a strong and prosperous country in the coming years, you don't want to put that off. You don't want to engage in a long grinding war of attrition, even though you are grinding down the Russians faster than they are grinding the Ukrainians down. They are holding down their level of casualties. I would advise President Zelensky, if you've got that counteroffensive against your Crimea in particular, go ahead and launch it. And I remember a number of months back when President Trump said to Zelensky in the White House, he says, "You don't have any cards to play." Yep. And Zelensky, I'll bet you, Zelensky was thinking, "Oh yes, I do," and he played them. And
he definitely played them, but being put on the spot like that in the Oval Office is probably the most.
That's awkward. And but you notice that the Ukrainians have diplomatically recovered from that. Yep. They now know how. They have now taken President Trump's measure, and they know how to negotiate with him. They have learned fast. Right. And so they have been successfully negotiating and reinforcing the support from the U.S., and this is something that will bode well for the Ukrainians in the coming months and years. So what they have to do now, so for Zelensky, develop that counteroffensive punch and launch it and force the Russians with a significant operational defeat to finally say, okay, we're quitting and going home. That's what he should do. For the Russians, for Vladimir Putin, I would not be inclined to negotiate with Vladimir Putin to begin with. So we're really talking about a very hypothetical situation here.
Yeah.
I'd say you need to recognize when to cut your losses and quit.
Right.
If you're at the poker table and you're losing hand after hand, you do not want to keep pouring your resources until you've lost all of your chips. You want to cut your losses because you're going to have enough of a problem recovering from this war and also fending off your ally, your so-called ally China. China has grievances against Russia. There are certain Russian territories in the Far East which China lays claim to. And they believe that they should have those territories that formerly were occupied by Russia. So Russia is going to have its hands full with China after this war is over. So I would say you'd better be prepared to reconsolidate and be prepared to fend off any Chinese aggression in the Far East.
That is a conversation that's come up in a couple of previous podcasts as well, is the potential for basically China knocking on the back door and taking a major amount of land from Russia if things do if they topple, if they go into civil war, if civil unrest of some kind. China's right there.
That possibility was brought up even during the Cold War. Harrison Salisbury, a New York Times reporter, had written. He was a defense reporter of types, and he wrote a book entitled "War Between Russia and China." He wrote it in 1969, when the Soviet and Chinese forces were having military clashes along the Ussuri River bordering Russia and China. So there was a major concern then. And also, by the way, you'll notice that in 1970, President Nixon took advantage of that with his trip to China.
Yeah.
He had the reputation of being an ardent anti-communist, but that paradoxically gave Nixon the flexibility to approach communist China and try to establish better relations, which he successfully did. And so there is historical precedent to learn from in this situation. So again, Russia and China, they have never liked each other. Okay, in either ethnically or the Chinese, for their part, if you want to talk about racist, we have nothing on the Chinese. Yeah. The Chinese view all non-Chinese as subhuman. We are less than fully human. Their Chinese will tolerate other Asians as being barely human. But anyone that is not ethnically Chinese, if you're black, if you're white, if you're Hispanic, if you're any, you are regarded as less than human. You are not a full human being. You might as well be an ape. And that's a harsh truth, but it is the truth. And that is something that we do not fully appreciate. But President Trump does get it. And he does have a very tough-minded approach towards dealing with the Chinese. He sees China as our real adversary, not Russia. And so to a certain extent, he is willing to take it easy on Russia, because Russia does not really have a sustainable power position for the remainder of the 21st century. Russia will be very fortunate if it even exists as a nation by the end of the 21st century. Why? Largely because of its demographic problems, their failure to maintain a sustainable birth rate. So, and by the way, China is suffering from that demographic problem too, because of their one-child policy.
I've had that conversation a number of times as of late with the countries around the world, right? And I don't actually know the number of countries that are having enough children right now, but it seems like the majority of the world is actually having a problem with this currently. Is that a fair assessment?
That's a fair assessment for the most part, but believe it or not, in the United States, guess which groups are not having a problem with having more children? Christian conservatives.
Christian conservatives. Yeah.
They are outbreeding the liberals. This is if you look at that as we're going to outbreed you SOBs, but whatever. But it's rather funny when you look at it that way. But
it is a bit comical when you think about it, but at the same time, it's also very sad. I think this is where we're seeing a big transition, especially in my generation, back to
which generation are you, by the way?
Technically, so I'm 29, so I believe I'm
Lord
technically a
have
Z
mercy.
Gen. Yeah,
you're young enough. You're almost young enough to be my grandson.
I believe I'm technically a Z Gen millennial. I'm right on the line. I've had this argument with friends a number of times as of late, but I believe I'm right on the line with being a millennial Z Gen, which is why I do get along with a lot of my like 40 to 45-year-old friends super well. But I also can still feel like I can connect to people in your early 20s, right on the cusp, right on the cusp. But
well, I just celebrated my 70th birthday.
Well, happy birthday.
Yes, indeed. I have officially passed into God's version of sudden death overtime.
You're in a great place in your life.
You betcha. And when you get past 70, remember when you get past 70, you're living on God's time.
We are. I would argue that we're all living on God's time at all times. Yes, we are. But
none of us has any control over when God is going to tap us on the shoulder and say it's time to come home.
I think I've finally come to terms with the fact that I have no control over it. So why think about it?
Exactly.
At the end of the day, just continue to act and do and try to be as productive as possible and enjoy the process along the way. So
there you go.
That's we're trying to do as best as we possibly can. I'm glad you brought up China, and I know it's a huge part of the podcast that you do. Russia, China, Ukraine, but with China specifically. This is the conversation around China seems to be very quiet right now, just in general. It's very much so Russia. It's very much so Gaza. It's very much so other situations around the world. It's not, there's like no conversation around China though. So they continue to sneakily do these things. They continue to go into countries and make deals with countries. They continue to seem to advance in their military with launching a new aircraft carrier recently. I believe it's their 4th aircraft carrier, if I'm not mistaken. I know you know much better on that topic than I would. But there doesn't seem to be a lot of noise around China. I'm curious to know, what is it that tips that? What is it that creates the noise around China so that people start actually paying attention? We talk about it all the time in my circles, but the majority of the population doesn't seem to have any idea what's going on with China long term.
Well, as you know, you might realize that China has a much longer historical perspective than any other nation.
They have been around
for a while. Matter of fact, Premier Zhou Enlai back in the 1970s was being interviewed, and he was asked what he thought was the historical significance of the Napoleonic Wars. Now, the Napoleonic Wars, as you know, went from 1793 to 1815. And Zhou Enlai's response was, "It's too soon to tell."
Yeah, I love that.
Okay. Yeah, that's an example of the
Chinese.
Puts
it into perspective for you.
Yeah. And when you have a civilization that is several thousand years old, okay, you tend to look at things in perspective. And the Chinese believe, with a certain degree of validity, they believe that they can outlast us. That the Americans, they'll be 250 years old next year. They're several thousand years. They regard us as transitory. We're now, mind you, we have a number of things going for us. With the fact that we are virtually impossible to invade. The only way you can invade the United States, well, as a matter of fact, right in World War II, the Admiral Yamamoto, after the successful attack on Pearl Harbor, was asked about the possibility of invading the United States. And Yamamoto replied, "I would never invade the United States. There would be a rifle beneath every blade of grass." And that was back in 1942. Okay. Yeah, today, there'd probably be a couple of rifles.
4 rifles underneath every blade of grass.
More rifles under every blade.
And a nuclear weapon underneath every blade of grass.
And matter of fact, the comedian Jeff Dunham, he was on a tour overseas, and he said, I think we ought to rename our country. We shouldn't call ourselves the United States. We should call ourselves crazy assholes with guns. But
I grew up listening to him. He's hysterical. He's
he
hysterical.
is. He has a very unique talent. He revived the art of ventriloquism. He revived it. It used to be just boring. Basically, he's a talented comedian, and he translated and he gave it a whole new twist with a whole bunch of puppets. And he has the unique ability to fool the listener into thinking that those puppets have separate personalities. That's the great.
They absolutely do have separate personalities, though. He has separate personalities, which come through his puppets.
It's impressive. It's almost like Charles Schulz in his comic strip Peanuts.
Yeah.
Comic strip. He in his 50 years of writing that comic strip, he projected every aspect of his personality into his characters. If you wanted to learn what Charles Schulz was like, all you had to do was read all 17,897 of his comic strips, and you would know what Charles Schulz was like. But in this, again, let's say we digress. We get back to China and their perspective and how they're going to, essentially how they believe that they are going to outlast us. But they have problems which they did not anticipate. They are learning to suffer. They have to suffer the consequences of their own actions. They are not immortal. They cannot. Their successive political governments are not necessarily going to be able to anticipate every problem or deal with it effectively. They may say they have a long-term strategy, but this does not guarantee that they are not the inevitable future of the world. And they're right now in a position where they can be lots of trouble for Russia, but they do not have the ability to project power the way the United States does. The United States is the only nation in the world that can still project military power to any point on the globe. And that is why, for example, the United States in Venezuela, dealing with Venezuela, what other power is going to try to project power to interfere with the United States? None. The United States Navy dominates the globe.
Here's on the Venezuela point, just while this is current events. Do you think, aside from having CIA, special forces, other things going on that we're not seeing on a daily basis, hybrid warfare of sorts occurring, do you think we'll actually see a kinetic approach here shortly?
Okay. Now that one, and like I say, I do not have access to
big shift here from China to Venezuela, but
that's fine. That's kind of I'm very agile in that respect, and but keep in mind, no other power can interfere with the United States in dealing as it will with Venezuela. Where it comes down to, again, in actually using military power against Venezuela, either to collapse the Maduro regime or to finish destroying its infrastructure or its ability to export drugs to the United States, there is little that any other nation can do to prevent the United States from doing that if it so chooses. So the key determinant here is logistics again. And the United States is the best in the world at logistics and projecting power. So right now, the United States has to, Secretary of War Hegseth has to be concerned with executing operations, executing the right amount of military power at the right time, using our intelligence assets, which are second to none, to determine what are the proper targets, what will be the most effective use of military power to achieve our objectives. And our logical political objective here against Venezuela is to force them to stop exporting drugs to the United States. And if it might require, now it could conceivably require the use of special forces in targeted military operations, because President Trump has said, we know where those drug lords are. We know where they live. The United States could end up using drones in selected strikes against Venezuela.
Right. I would argue that the majority of Trump's base supported him going into this because he was a very anti-war president. Now that we've seen the results of Iran, which I believe was an incredible precision strike, personally,
no doubt.
I mean, incredible. did not escalate it into anything further, which is very
Correct.
impressive. Nothing against it. But we're obviously starting to see the president act in more of a warlike state. And so I'm curious to know, in your opinion, does it behoove him to continue to act in more of a clandestine kind of fashion versus a very kinetic, open war in which they actually go in and physically take out the president of Venezuela with his base that he already seems to be kind of having some issues with everything else that's going on. Once again, that's subjective. Everybody has their own opinion, but what do you think really benefits him the most? Quiet, quick, clean, or loud?
He is adapting. He will adapt his use of his various elements of power to fit the situation. There is no, from his perspective, there is no one-size-fits-all strategy.
Right.
So therefore, and the Trump administration is in the process of developing what I would call its strategic doctrine, its national strategy, its national security strategy. If first, from observing this Trump administration at the beginning, one would be tempted to think that it had an ad hoc approach. Well, we'll just do it whatever looks good at the time, instead of using an overall strategy. However, given what the Trump administration is trying to accomplish, they need a grand strategy. That is one level of strategy higher than normal national security strategy. The best example of a grand strategy, the grand strategy of a nation, its timeline extends for decades, if not centuries, into the future. This is your long-term goal for achieving your maximum potential as a nation. The premier example of the use of grand strategy was during the Cold War. The United States actually had a grand strategy. It was the grand strategy called containment, which was espoused by George Kennan in the 1947 issue of Foreign Affairs. And the basic thesis of containment was we did not have to defeat the Soviet Union militarily in order to defeat communism. All we had to do was prevent them from expanding, prevent them from achieving through either subversion or military conquest, to contain it within its current boundaries and within its Eastern European sphere of influence, and eventually the Soviet Union, according to Kennan, would buckle under the stresses of its own internal contradictions. History proved that Kennan was right. Pure and simple. We successfully executed that grand strategy. The big advantage of that grand strategy was it did not matter which political party was in power, whether you had a Democrat as president or whether you had a Republican. The grand strategy, both parties adhered to that grand strategy of containment, and that's why the United States succeeded in the Cold War against the Soviet Union. Now that you have a post-Cold War situation where the United States does not have any one unifying opponent for a grand strategy, now you have to take a different approach. The grand strategy, and I have explained this in my book, The Russian View of U.S. Strategy, as well as in the previous book, The Soviet View of U.S. Strategic Doctrine. What we have to establish in the post-Cold War period is a new grand strategy designed to work for the United States in the coming decades and centuries. We'll adhere to this grand strategy until Jesus returns, as far as I'm concerned. Either the world ceases to exist, we cease to exist, or we have divine intervention. So this grand strategy, in my opinion, that the United States should develop and adhere to in the coming decades and centuries is for the United States to be the world's geopolitical balancer. We are the balancer, not the world's policeman. We are not the American empire. We are not policing the world. We are not changing regimes to suit our preferences. We become the balancer. There is a historical analogy for this. Great Britain, vis-a-vis the continent of Europe during the 18th and 19th centuries, they acted as the balancer vis-a-vis the continent of Europe. The idea was to prevent any hostile power or combination of powers from dominating the world island of Europe and Asia. And that's how Great Britain conducted its affairs under that kind of grand strategy. In the case of the United States, we become, in the 21st century and beyond, we become the geopolitical balancer. We prevent any hostile power from dominating the world island or from threatening to become the global dominant power. We neutralize them. We balance them. We force them to start channeling Mr. Rogers and behave like good neighbors. That's the objective. You want the world to start acting like Fred Rogers and learn how to be a good neighbor.
So if that is the grand strategy, if geopolitical balance is our grand strategy, what happens with the space race?
There you go.
This is my favorite part. These are all the fun questions. I love Star Wars. I love the space race.
And here's where one of the keys to this, one of the interesting keys to this, is President Trump's declaration of creating the Golden Dome.
Yep.
Now, the Golden Dome has the right idea, but they don't necessarily have the optimum strategy to achieve it. Why? Because the Golden Dome has as its objective the ability to prevent a nuclear attack on the United States. Essentially what that does is you are in effect neutralizing the nuclear arsenals of Russia, China, North Korea, whatever nuclear power seeks to attack the United States. But in order to do that, you have to the Congress has recognized they recognize they need to study space-based defense systems. There's a big problem with that. If you have space-based systems, we have to have satellites in space that can shoot down nuclear missiles. Well, the Chinese and the Russians don't like that idea. They already have what I would call space denial capabilities. They have counter space weapons designed to shoot down our satellites. So if you are going to construct a Golden Dome, you have to have a space presence that is capable of defeating Russian and Chinese counter space satellites. The only way you do that, you don't do it with other satellites. All the defense contractors are talking about building hundreds of satellites. That's my experience in the Army after next winter war game, when it created a similar situation in space. When you have satellites versus satellites, you have an unstable hair trigger situation in space. It's like having a Mexican standoff in low Earth orbit. The side that fires first has a decisive advantage. So, how do you prevent a Mexican standoff in low Earth orbit? The United States has to construct a space fleet, manned space fleet with manned aircraft. Where are you going to get the manned space fleet from? SpaceX, Elon Musk. You tell Elon, before you go toddling off to Mars and trying to colonize Mars with hundreds of starships, which I believe is logistically impossible as well as biologically impossible, and that's a whole separate discussion. But Elon would be much better served, and so would the people of the world, if Elon built starships for a space fleet. For the United States to have a manned space fleet, which would be capable of armed with lasers, which would be capable of destroying not only opposing Russian and Chinese counter space satellites, but also with those same lasers, you could block and destroy nuclear missiles launched at the United States by destroying them in their boost phase before they reach Earth orbit. You have a space fleet. Guess what that space fleet could also do? That space fleet could also have the mission of cleaning up space junk. Get the junk out of
mining, other planets or meteors, etc.
It would make, by making space, by being able to control Earth orbital space, you are creating a stable platform for economically exploiting the resources of the solar system. You can explore it, you can mine asteroids, you can do all those wonderful things and bring unbelievable amounts of wealth to the people of the world. But you cannot do that unless you first have neutralized nuclear weapons as weapons of war. The way you do that is through the Golden Dome. The way you make the Golden Dome perfect, you have to have a space fleet as its central component. Nobody's talking about a space fleet right now, except you and me, right? At this point, I talk about we have to have a space fleet. I remember seeing this one presentation by CSIS in Washington D.C. He said, we don't have a version of Billy Mitchell advocating space power. Well, guess what? You're going to have to settle for Dr. Lockwood, because right now Dr. Lockwood's the only person that I'm aware of that's advocating a space fleet for the United States. And oh, by the way, the nice thing about a space fleet, you have a space fleet with starships, those European allies of ours, and say, hey, I wish we could have a space fleet. Well, guess what, fella? You can buy it right from SpaceX and Elon Musk.
You could buy
that space fleet. We'll get you such a deal. You can be part of our allies as part of an allied space fleet. And guess what? You've got a 21st century version of Starfleet Command. Shades of Star Trek.
I want to come back to the space fleet here in a second, but I also want to hit on something you mentioned earlier. Knocking out nuclear weapons in their boost phase.
Yes.
Is there...
That's the only way you can do it.
But as it relates to... Sorry.
Yeah. The reason I say boost phase, you can't... Right now, our current ballistic missile defenses are only capable of intercepting nuclear missiles in mid-course, when they're at the top of their orbit, where they're top of their arc, or terminal phase, when they're on their way down. Waiting until the nuclear missile is on its way down is the worst possible situation for trying to intercept a ballistic missile. They can deploy decoys, they can maneuver, and they can make it much harder for you to effectively intercept nuclear missiles. You could, at a certain point, if you can catch them in their mid-course phase, that's somewhat better, but they can still deploy decoys, they can still maneuver. The most effective way to destroy a nuclear missile is in its boost phase. When it's on its way up, it is slow moving at that point. It cannot maneuver because it's trying to achieve orbital velocity. It cannot deploy decoys. It's in the atmosphere. It can't do that. But if you are in Earth orbit and you are firing down with a laser,
right,
there's no atmosphere to block the laser. You can effectively hit a nuclear missile on its way up. You don't have to have that much energy in the laser. You don't need it. If you were trying to intercept a nuclear missile from using a ground-based laser, you've got a very thick atmosphere that you have to punch through for the laser beam to punch through in order to be able to effectively engage. So that kind of missile, you would have to have a million-watt laser, ground-based, in order to be able to do that. But if you have it based in space, it doesn't need to be a million-watt laser. It can be just a several hundred-watt laser.
So you keep saying if we have it based in space. I have a feeling we already have it based in space. It's just not being discussed.
Now, I will grant you that. That could be the case. That's the X factor. That's the classified portion.
Right.
Our adversaries do not know whether or not we actually have that kind of a presence, or whether or not we could rapidly deploy it and build up a space fleet. And right now, with Elon Musk's starships, assuming that he gets those perfected so they don't have accident, they're very reliable, you could very rapidly build up, using the U.S. Space Force, build up its manpower, get them up there so they are in Earth orbit. And mind you, the tours of duty for a Space Force in low Earth orbit, we already have the experience. We know how long those tours should be. Yeah, the optimum tour would be, from my point of view, 6-month tour in space for Space Force personnel, maximum 1 year, because after you get out of Earth orbit, you've got to medically recover,
right? Because
of low Earth because of lesser gravity. But a space fleet is very feasible, unlike a mission to Mars, which is practically problematic because of radiation problems, low gravity problems, the fact that any crew that goes to Mars you would practically be signing their death warrant, because once they return, they would have severe medical issues. And so that's why I do not regard, at this time, sending a manned crew to Mars you would have to use AI robots because they're not medically affected. You would send AI robots to Mars, but don't send humans.
Well, we now have that capability, as has been seen at a very commercial level now too. I'm not sure if you've seen the video, the Neobots that recently came out and everything else that China just released theirs, and it walks very human-like too. Then the Russians launched theirs, and it fell flat on its face. It was kind of funny to watch.
It was. That was really amazing.
I'm sure you loved that.
Yes, indeed. It's typical. Well, it kind of reminds me of the joke during the Cold War about the joke goes that the Russians are working on a nuclear suitcase, being able to put a nuclear bomb in a suitcase. And they said, well, what's their problem? Oh, well, they don't have any problem with a nuclear weapon. Their problem is they can't perfect the suitcase.
That's wonderful. I love that. I love that. So I have to, as we continue to talk about the space fleet, I have to relate to some recent current events, I guess. But the UFOs, UAPs, the orbs, the things that are starting to be released in Congress. What do you think of those particular flying objects? What maybe do you think they are? Are they, I guess I'll just frame it like this. Are they maybe something that's not of this earth? Are they of this earth and advanced and we just don't know about it? What is your take?
My take on that is that they either may be special weapons, which nobody is talking about, or what the role of the Space Force would be in this kind of thing if we develop a space fleet. Right. Obviously, you also have to have Space Force intelligence. You have to have the ability. And what would the role of Space Force intelligence be? They would be, for one thing, they would be tying into our exploration or observations of neighboring star systems, looking for potential alien life developed on those planets. And logically, our primary zone of concern would be anything within 125 light years of Earth. Why is that? Because we have been broadcasting radio signals for the past 125 years. Therefore, any alien civilization that would even discover our presence would have to be able to discover our radio signals. And our radio signals would be very faint. They would have to have some awesome equipment to be able to detect radio signals at that range. So why haven't we had, I would echo the opinion of one science fiction podcaster. He says, why haven't we been visited by aliens? Nobody knows we're here yet.
Yeah, not yet.
Not yet.
It is amazing to think about the vast, the size of the universe, and to think that we've only been broadcasting for 125 years, and that that would truly
so therefore
be our
there is
connection.
this radius. There is this. That's why I say there is this radius around the planet Earth, 125 years, and that radius expands as the radio signals can keep going, and they get more and more dispersed. But that is the largest sphere in which any alien civilization farther than 125 light years away would have to be extremely lucky. They would have to know where to point their detection equipment, not knowing what they're looking for. And so they have no way of knowing what they're going to find. But any alien civilization within 125 light years of Earth would at least have a signal, assuming they get the awesome equipment to detect it, that would be able to look in our direction. So right now, I would say that, but the main missions of a Space Force fleet, of Space Force, would be, one, make sure that Earth orbit is under benign control, that you don't have hostile powers threatening to use nuclear weapons. That's how the Golden Dome would work. You would also clean up space junk, because there's a lot of problems with that. If they're not doing other things, they're basically gathering in those pieces of space junk and taking them to the lunar junkyard. That's what you use a moon base for, a lunar junkyard, among other things. You establish a scientific base on the moon, long term. That's a useful purpose. You can do that. We can sustain that logistically. You can get them. You can rotate those crews on a 6-month to 1 year basis, and at least you wouldn't have to worry about severe medical problems the way you would if you tried to send crews to Mars. The only way that Mars and other planets become feasible is, one, we would have to have simulated Earth gravity on those spaceships. They have to maintain full Earth gravity. And you also have to have nearly foolproof protection against radiation. Those are the two main showstoppers. Unless you can overcome that, you have to rely on AI robots.
Well, transhumanism gets mentioned a lot, and I almost have this feeling that there is a goal of certain individuals, I'd say Elon Musk especially, to send AI robots alongside humans that have been given certain capabilities, right? Because if that may be the only way, right, to be able to survive. And so I like to think that these things have already been thought through. Not that it's a good thing, but I think, to your point, that might be the only way for certain human-like creatures to exist and make that distance, make that travel without committing suicide, basically.
Well, basically, my standpoint as a Christian, looking at it as a Christian, God did not design our bodies to function anywhere outside of or an Earth environment. Now, the only way, and I'm probably one of the only people in the world that believes this, but that if according to the Bible, Christ returns and we are all given immortal bodies, we become immortal. We will not be able to die. We don't have to worry about death or anything like that. Under those circumstances, in a world in which we are all immortal, we never age, never get sick, never die, that is when, under God's supervision, we will be able to explore the rest of God's universe. That is when it will occur. Not while we are still tethered to a mortal lifespan. And people like Elon Musk, who did not believe in God, and all these people who are advocating exploring or transplanting human civilization to Mars, these are people who inherently, for the most part, if you were to ask them, they don't believe in God. They are trying to establish their own immortality. They are trying to, in effect, become God themselves. And to me, that is a fool's errand. So what you have to do is, we have to operate within our own human limitations for now. We use humanoid robots. We can reach out and explore. We can make life better for the people of Earth while we are still in this currently mortal state. We can explore. We could maximally, I foresee, we could exploit the resources of the solar system, bring back wealth to make life on Earth better, make Earth more sustainable, and do things of that nature. But this idea that we are somehow, with our current human limitations, reach out and start colonizing other planets, again, not until you have perfected Earth. You have artificial gravity, near foolproof protection against radiation, and you also have to be able to get there fast. 6 to 7 month trips to Mars? No way. You would go absolutely bonkers. There have been simulations where your people try to survive in a sort of an artificial biodome. It doesn't work. They find and you can imagine on a spaceship to Mars, when you are trapped with other people, there's no turning back. That the psychological implications of that alone make manned missions to Mars, let alone the colonization of Mars, extremely problematic. The only thing that makes it, if we were to perfect nuclear fusion power, something which is, at least, we're now starting to generate more energy out of fusion reactions than we have to put into it. Right. The rule of thumb here, the simple rule is, nuclear fission is easy to start, but really hard to stop. Nuclear fusion is hard to start, but really easy to stop, because it's so complex. Right. But if you could get a nuclear fusion reactor and have that powering your starships, you could get to Mars in about a week or two. That makes exploration of Mars and temporary base, that's what makes it at least feasible, because then you've knocked out that long time in space problem. But you need the development of nuclear fusion power in order to do that, in order to cut the travel time down between planets. And you have to improve the shielding, and you just basically have to make significant improvements all the way around, as well as being able to, again, stimulate Earth gravity to forestall those medical problems. They are severe challenges, but again, barring the second coming of Christ, this is what you're going to have to live with. You have to deal with in terms of, because our science is not sophisticated enough to be able to overcome those problems.
Well, I really appreciate your explanation as a Christian, because when you try to delve into these topics, certain individuals are incapable is a terrible word, unable to go into depth and discuss what it, not just the coming of Christ, but what that's maybe going to look like in the future as it relates to where we are in our human cycle as humanity exists today. So I appreciate you framing it the way that you did. It's really, it helps me too, as a fellow Christian, to be able to think through and be like, yeah, this is absolutely right.
Once Christ returns, heaven is beyond all human imagination.
Right.
No matter how good or how wonderful you think heaven is going to be, God will top it.
Absolutely.
Because God has no limits. Most people can, hardly anyone, including myself, can comprehend the concept of an infinite God. And
this is a conversation I've had with a really good friend of mine as of late. It's like, why do we put limits on God? Why do we try to put limits on God? Why do we discuss it as though God has limits? We don't actually know. It's a beautiful thing. There are no limits for God.
That's correct.
That's incredible.
And the thing is, here's something which will blow your mind. When God looks at you and me as individuals, he does not just see us here in the moment. An infinite God can see you as you were when you were a baby, as you were when you were a toddler, as you were as a teenager, a young adult, a middle-aged adult, and finally he even sees you at near the hour of your death, all at once. All at once. And because God is infinite, when you pray to God, because God is outside of time, he has all time at his disposal. He exists in all times and all places. So therefore, when you pray to God, he has as much time to listen to your prayer as if you were the only person he had ever created. Because if you divide all the number of people who have ever existed into infinity, what's your answer? Infinity.
Infinity. That's beautiful.
So that is why I am fundamentally very optimistic about the potential of space travel for the people of Earth. But they have to put it in perspective. There are two phases. The space travel that is possible in our current human existence. There are certain things which make space travel very useful and desirable for the people of Earth, and particularly the United States. They can do that. Rocket fuel. Speaking of my own rocket fuel,
the good stuff.
I had to have the good. My wife keeps me supplied with the good stuff.
I had an energy drink earlier, so I'm drinking a bunch of water right now to calm myself.
Oh, really? Okay. Well,
the
I'm on the other end.
Is flowing.
I'm on the other end of the curve. I'm getting juiced up here. I'm going to have to power down. I'm going to have to power down after this podcast.
I find that if I have too much caffeine going, I don't actually think straight. I ramble on, and so I like to calm myself down with a little bit of a bunch of water after enough caffeine.
Well, my first experience with coffee was back when I was around 2 years old as a toddler, and I was living in St. Petersburg, Florida, and this was back in the era of percolated coffee. Those percolated coffee.
I just had percolated coffee this week. My mom made some percolated coffee for us.
Isn't it awesome?
Yeah, it's great. It's really
awesome?
Good.
It is
really good.
And the thing is, my mom used to make percolated coffee in the morning for breakfast, and breakfast at our house were bacon and eggs and toast and percolated coffee with cream and sugar. And of course, my dad would be sitting at the table reading the newspaper, and I would come toddling in, and he would get up to go to work. He would leave the table, and he would always leave about a half cup of coffee, lukewarm. He would never finish that beautiful cream and sugar and percolated coffee. And I would get in the chair, and I would imitate my dad, and I'd be looking through the newspaper and trying to read, usually turning to the comic strips and the other stuff. And of course, I'd look at that coffee, I smelled it, and I said, "Have cream and sugar and coffee, percolated coffee." Oh yeah, I was hooked. And my mom wondered why I was bouncing around the house for the rest of the day.
It wasn't just the toddler energy; it was the coffee.
It was the coffee. But
so I appreciate, first and foremost, I appreciate the time that you spent tonight diving into all these topics. And the more that we've talked about it, I've realized that we could go into each one of these in a lot more depth and spend a whole lot of time on it. So
here we go.
Ideally,
Dr. Jonathan Lockwood, the continuing series.
I mean, exactly. I would love to have you back on. Especially as it relates to the space fleet. I didn't realize we were going to get that deep into the space fleet tonight. And I think that in of itself could be an entire episode, which would be very fun.
Matter of fact, I developed an entire PowerPoint briefing, which I keep essentially in my hip pocket in case I need it in the future to develop plans for a space fleet. I update that PowerPoint briefing and refine the missions and so forth. And I've explained some of the concepts tonight briefly as to what a space fleet would do. And right now, I am probably arguably the only advocate for a U.S. manned space fleet. And we could do it. It solves a number of problems. And should this come to the attention of the Trump administration, and if they want to know more about it, I'm perfectly willing to discuss it.
We can send this. We can send that particular episode right along.
Send that episode. I'll say, okay, Mr. President, ready to talk about this. Have I got a deal for you?
Are you sure we want to share that with the public though, or is that an episode that
sharing it with the public is a very interesting concept, because right now that is a concept of a space fleet, creating a lobby for a space fleet. There is very useful, because a space fleet could also take over the functions of what we currently use satellites for. And I would use as the inspiration for that, believe it or not, a classic Star Trek episode. Look this one up. Assignment Earth. Assignment Earth. It was originally intended to be used as a crossover episode for a new television series, using the characters that were in that episode. But in Assignment Earth, during the episode, Scotty is in the transporter room, and he's looking at a monitor. He is monitoring the launch site for a Saturn V rocket that is going to supposedly put orbital nuclear warheads in orbit. Okay, he's monitoring the launch site, trying to locate Mr. Seven, he's the one that triggers this whole episode. And he's basically shows him using the monitor to get pictures of, in real time, the launch site. Now, that is a function which would have to be performed by satellites. Right. But in the episode, it's the Enterprise that is the orbital platform monitoring the launch sites. So this inspires the concept of using the starships, Elon Musk's starships. You put the satellite reconnaissance equipment on board the starships, and the starship becomes the platform, not the satellite. That makes it much less vulnerable to Russian and Chinese counterspace weapons.
Because of defense capabilities and offensive capabilities? Because of the defense
capabilities of the starship. And the beautiful thing about it is it also has great deterrence value. If a Russian or Chinese counterspace weapon attacks and destroys a satellite, nobody cares. Satellites don't have mothers. Right. But if a Russian or Chinese counterspace satellite attacks a U.S. starship, manned by Space Force personnel, that is a clear and unmistakable act of war.
Right.
That starship would have permission to either preemptively strike and destroy Russian Chinese counter space satellites, but it would have the capability to defend itself. It could maneuver, and therefore that's why a space fleet is a much more useful thing, and oh, by the way, a lot cheaper than, because Elon Musk already can crank out those starships. He on demand. For a useful starting point for a space fleet, it would be if you had, I'd say about 12 starships would make a nice starter fleet for a U.S. Space Force. You could put 2 of those starships in on the moon as a part of a lunar base. Another 2 starships would go in geosynchronous orbit to defend against near-Earth objects trying to hit Earth, such as a comet or meteor, asteroid. They provide early warning and ways to take action, gives you more options. And the other 8, they form a constellation of starships around Earth, providing the core of the Golden Dome. They all have lasers. They're all able to shoot down nuclear missiles. They are also able to clean up space junk when they're not worrying about that other stuff. They can perform reconnaissance missions. They can do all sorts of things that we cannot do now. What a space fleet does is it gives the United States and the world more options in case of a problem.
I love it. I think now I have to go back and watch Assignment Earth first and foremost.
You go and watch Assignment Earth, and you'll see.
And then, as a follow-up, I would love to do an entire episode on your space fleet plan.
Oh, sure.
If you're up for it.
Oh, yeah. If you're up. Hey, give me enough coffee. I'll be up for anything.
All right, wonderful. I want to leave people tonight with the LAMP method. Yes. We've not really delved into it much at all. You also made a couple of points about the website and some other things that may be available. So I'd love to give you the opportunity to dive into LAMP and explain what that is to people and where they can learn more about it.
Okay, now there is a LAMP website. Basically, it's really simple to get to more information about the LAMP. Okay, so LAMP stands for Lockwood Analytical Method for Prediction. It is a method that I invented out of necessity back in 1992 when I was a 1992-1993 fellow in the Director of Central Intelligence Exceptional Intelligence Analyst Program. They had selected me for this program, and I proposed my project. My project was to study the perceptions of the 4 nuclear republics of the former Soviet Union: Russia, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Belarus. And I proposed to study their perceptions and the implications for arms control, potential for armed conflict, that sort of thing. Well, as I began my research, I realized that there was no analytical methodology that was suitable for studying this problem. And so I eventually, in the course of my research, actually, it all crystallized for me when I was on a trip I was on my first trip to Moscow. I'd come back, and I was on a train, a German Bundesbahn train, going from Heidelberg to Munich. And I was sitting there in the train, having a nice cup of German coffee, nice strong one too. Ooh, and all of a sudden, everything crystallized. How to develop this analytical methodology. The 12 steps became the 12 steps of the LAMP method. And so I developed it and I jotted it down. By the time I reached Munich, I had my 12 steps. And then from there, I was able to develop it, incorporate it into my master's thesis for my Master's of Science of Strategic Intelligence degree. My senior rater and my rater said that they encouraged me to further develop the LAMP because they saw great potential for it for the intelligence community. I developed it. I began teaching it to students at the Joint Military Intelligence College. I eventually taught it online to the online students at American Military University. Over the course of a decade and a half, I taught the LAMP method to thousands of students online and in the classroom. And it took on a life of its own. I had a student who developed the website for me where people can access it today. All they have to do, all your listeners have to do, is just Google Lockwood Analytical Method for Prediction. Google that. It will give you a number of links. It will take you to the LAMP. It will give you a link to the LAMP website, where it gives you my bio. It gives you a whole list of student papers that were done using the LAMP. It gives you, all sorts of good information. It gives you my bio at the time. Of course, a very old picture of me with more hair, and looking very happy at the same time. So
if you'd like, I can use that picture as your picture for the episode, if you'd like, or if there's another picture.
You can use that.
You tell me.
You can use that younger picture of me. I won't hurt my feelings. But in any case, the LAMP is also published as a textbook by Bloomsbury Publishers. It is available in hard copy, paperback, as well as in ebook format. So people who are enterprising enough to want to buy a copy of it, fine. Again, it's not going to set me up for retirement. Sorry, I've already got my retirement pension. But it will give them a very useful insight into how to use the LAMP method. And that would be, and I could go, an episode on the LAMP would be, basically I have a briefing that I've used, and I could present the LAMP, an entire lecture or program on the LAMP at a future time, as well as a separate thing for space power theory, which again, I also have a separate PowerPoint briefing that I use as a guideline. But I think
an episode on LAMP would also be super beneficial. As I've continued to do this podcast over now 55, 56 episodes, I've realized one of the biggest things that I've been doing for myself is improving my critical thinking, and I think it's really important.
This would be very good for that sort of thing. Yeah.
So I think it's really important for people to be able to better understand how to think about certain things. I'm not telling you how to think or what to think. I think it's important to be able to figure out how to assess and to think through certain things. And I just think in our society nowadays, things are short clips, short bits of information, and you move on. But going deep and delving deeper into a topic is super necessary to really understand what's actually going on.
Well, I can tell you as a final little treat here, I can tell you an exercise that I recently developed, which I am planning to present to a school in our area, a group of talented and gifted students, one of those tag programs. And the teacher is real excited about this one. I say, okay, for your talented and gifted students, I'm going to give them an imaginary problem based on a Star Trek episode. Okay, here's the thing. Now, most students today, the classic Star Trek episode is before all of their times. Students in the 21st century have no concept of what classic Star Trek looks like. And in this case, the episode that I would have the teacher show them, and you can look up this episode yourself and see what I mean. The classic Star Trek episode, The Doomsday Machine. Watch that episode. Preferably use the computer enhanced version rather than the original cheesy graphics of the 1960s. They upgraded the episode with superior graphics later on.
I feel like you could probably also say, give it to an AI tool and say, I want to watch this particular episode of Star Trek. Please enhance it for me.
Yeah.
It's wild.
It's already been enhanced, but this would be a good one. So anyway, I would have the students watch the Doomsday Machine episode, enhanced. Okay, and in that episode, Spock was recommending that we get the Enterprise encounters a planet-killing device that's designed to chop up worlds and digest the rubble for fuel. Okay, very interesting. The Enterprise defeated that planet-killing episode by sending the wounded Constellation into it and detonating it, thus destroying the planet killer's interior. But that's how they did it in the original episode. Spock had been recommending we must escape this device's subspace interference and warn Starfleet Command. Because in the episode, the planet killer was on its way to the Rigel colony star system, which had millions of inhabitants. And so the commander felt they had to just stop the planet killer from reaching the Rigel system. Okay, that's how they did in the original episode. In this problem, I tell the students, okay, all of you are now members of Starfleet Command in the 23rd century. You are all at your positions, and you're conducting your business, when suddenly you receive a message, a subspace message from Captain Kirk of the Starship Enterprise. He informs you that they have encountered a planet-killing device. On Mr. Spock's recommendation, they, instead of engaging the planet killer as the way they did in the episode, now they have escaped the subspace interference from the planet killer, and they are warning Starfleet Command. So now I tell so now that you are all members of Starfleet Command in the 21st century, what do you do? What do you do? What questions are you going to ask the Enterprise about the planet killer? And basically I have all these answers set up for them. So depending on the questions that they ask, first they have to ask the right questions. They have to ask certain questions. And then based on the answers that you get, how are you going to stop the planet killer from destroying the Rigel colony? What do? You can't find the answer on the internet. There is no way. AI, I tested this myself. AI cannot help you. AI does not have the creativity or the imagination or the ability to think critically. It is incapable of that. AI right now is essentially a massive data cruncher. It cannot exercise original thought. And oh, by the way, there's another great episode of classic Star Trek that I'll pass along to you. The title is The Ultimate Computer. It's a very far-thinking, a very forward-looking classic Star Trek episode which experiments with a ultimate AI computer. They don't call it AI, they call it M5. But it was designed to run a starship without human control and make human beings irrelevant. But
they were a bit ahead of their time.
Very ahead of their time. This is 1966 that episode came out. But it was very forward-thinking. It warned of the dangers of AI. And so another great episode that's a separate one. The one with the Doomsday Machine, I've created that problem, which I'm going to test with these students and see how close to my wife Kathleen has developed a very elegant solution, which I'll tell you about separately sometime.
Okay.
But she developed a very elegant school solution to how Starfleet Command would defeat the planet killer. And but it's a very unexpected type strategy, very creative. She's good at that. And
when you've read tens of thousands of books, I think you get pretty creative.
She has read tens of thousands of books, and she said that if she does not have my highly retentive memory, being able to focus, she says I can see the big picture, and I can also hyperfocus to an incredible degree on very narrow topics. But she has just this sheer massive ability to speed read and gather information and read almost like a human computer.
Right.
And so what's interesting, she's developed this very elegant strategy for my problem, and that is what I will use as a standard for the students. It's an extra credit problem. It's not a thing it's not really pass fail, but it's designed to test their ability to think critically and creatively. And these are about middle school students, middle school and high school. But I can test that with just about any level.
Well, I think it's important for everybody to go through and go through a challenge a mental challenge like that, especially as we age too. Some of us tend to get into our own bubbles and we stop thinking critically, or we don't maybe have to think as critically on a daily basis because we get in such a routine. So I think it is good to keep it going and to continue.
And that's why I do these podcasts, by the way, because at my age of 70, one of my mentors told me never retire in the sense of, I'm just going to kick back, drink beer, and vegetate for the rest of my life. Right. No, that is not what you're.
Doesn't seem to do anybody any good. That's the
No,
more
it doesn't.
I hear.
No,
The less you move, the less you do, the less conversations you have, the less analytical you are. Whatever. The less you challenge yourself, the quicker you seem to move
age and decay.
Correct.
And so basically, what I want to do is be able to be happily engaged in various activities until suddenly one day God taps me on the shoulder, says, "Okay, stop having so much fun down here. Time to come home. Your time is up." Oh shucks.
Well, Dr. Lockwood, I'm looking forward to plenty more of these conversations. Once again, it's not often that I hop on and I'm like, hey, I would love to just keep doing this. And I'm also the type that I would love to talk for hours. But I also, I think about a viewer and what they're willing to listen to. I think, an hour to maybe a couple hours, that's a long form podcast. You're listening for the 3 to 4 hours. It takes me sometimes 2, 3, 4 days because I have to keep going back to it to listen to things that I am interested in. But I'm like, if I can just share it in a shorter time window, then I can maybe make it a little more easy to consume.
Yeah,
for that.
No, that's fine. So, as a matter of fact, for this particular one, I BCC'd forwarded your intro description to a number of my friends. Yep. One of them wrote back, said, "Oh wow, this is awesome." And I said, "Yeah, well." Hey, I've never gotten an intro quite like that one before, but that's okay, because the only thing that I would ask, Cameron, is that once you are prepared for the actual air date of our session here,
absolutely,
if you would give me a sufficient to let me know what day and the link it would actually be broadcast, so that I can then forward that link to all my special distribution list.
Absolutely.
They can say, okay, it's going to be aired on this date. Tune in at such and such a time, and there it is. And that'll be great. That'll be great, and I can get some really good feedback then.
Well, I most certainly will, and I'm actually going to go ahead and wrap this up for us and click the stop recording button. Is there anything else you want to add, though, before we part ways this evening?
Well, nothing more really to add for this evening, and we're going to have. I can tell that we're going to have a number of topics to discuss in the future. I advise listeners, if they want to look up Russia, Ukraine, China. I keep trying to get the order right, but they broadcast on YouTube. And all the episodes that we have broadcast since, I believe, August of 2022 are on YouTube. So
I'll include that in the show notes as well, so people can check that out also.
Okay, fantastic.
All righty. Well, I appreciate the time and look forward to talking to you here very soon.
Okay, great.